Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. This is week 2 of the return of Power Hour. I hope you enjoyed the last episode. If you've heard it, if not, go back and listen to it. At least many of the listeners wrote very nice notes and said they enjoyed it. This week's theme is going to be, shouldn't be a big surprise if you are listening near when this is coming out, which is Wednesday, March 18th. We're talking about what's often called the coronavirus or COVID-19, and we're going to talk about it and in particular its relationship to energy. Now, my goal today is to share 4 ideas with you about COVID-19 that you probably haven't heard and you probably won't hear anywhere else, but I think these ideas are important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you the ideas first, and then I might even add in a 5th that's even more controversial than these, but I want to give these to you first, and then we're going to jump in and I'll bring on my co-hosts in a minute, and they will join me in discussing these two. But the ideas at a high level are, idea number 1 is the increasingly prevalent COVID-19 policy of indefinite universal isolation is immoral and un-American. And I'll unpack that, but all 3 elements of those are important. Indefinite universal isolation. Idea number 2 is going to be that climate change obsession prevented us from paying attention to real threats like coronavirus, or I'll actually put it as climate change fixation, prevented us from paying attention to real threats like coronavirus. Number 3 is a Green New Deal would be fatal in the fight against coronavirus. And number 4 is our biggest ally in the fight. Oh, actually, that's going to be a corollary. So that's sort of idea 3A. Our biggest ally in the fight against coronavirus is the fossil fuel industry. And then the final idea is that the corona recession that we're starting is a mild preview of the Green New Deal. So you're not going to get anything uncontroversial today, but I think all of these ideas are very, very important for going forward at this point where there's just a ton of confusion and a ton of fear and a ton of suffering in a way that's most consistent with human flourishing. This is not a time of increasing human flourishing, and there's a lot to be worried about in terms of the wrong policy. So I wanted to share my perspective and bring the Center for Industrial Progress team on the call. So I'll welcome from Pennsylvania, Don Watkins. Hey, Don.
Hey, Alex.
And from Germany, Stefan Henna. Hey, Stefan.
Hey, good to be back.
Good to have you. So I'm going to first start out with this idea, and I haven't run all these things by you guys, so I'll you can jump in at any point, but this idea that the COVID-19 policy of indefinite universal isolation is immoral and un-American. So I want to start out by saying the following, that I absolutely believe we should be very concerned about COVID-19, and in particular because it's very good at human, in the bad sense, at human-to-human transmission. Now, I think there's a lot of unknown about how good it is, but there's a lot of evidence that it's quite good, and that's an undesirable attribute for a virus to have. Now, it's not airborne in the technical sense, and that's going to be important. It's not something that can just be that you can just pass easily to somebody 600 feet away, and so that has implications for what policy should be. It's not like, I believe, measles has that kind of quality, but it is something that's a real concern that I think government has a certain role in, and but both with government and individuals, we need to think about how do we deal with this in a way that's consistent with human flourishing. And then part of that, and the part I want to focus on today, is people being free to pursue their livelihoods. And this is something that I've noticed, and it's been really upsetting, that when people are making their personal and corporate and certainly political policies about this, the whole focus is how do we slow the rate of spread of this virus, which is itself, that's obviously an important consideration, but there's very little focus on how do we protect people's right to pursue their livelihoods. And what we've seen is the implicit policy that's being embraced increasingly is what I'm calling indefinite universal isolation. So I want to break that down because all the points of that are important. So isolation, I'll start with isolation, is the idea that people are being isolated from one another. It's often called social distancing. I think isolation captures more the negative of it. And so that's one element of it. And all things being equal, when there's contagious diseases around, one wants to be more isolated to protect oneself from it. So there's that element. But then there's the universal element of it, which I want to come back to and really challenge, which is that everyone should be doing this. And this is increasingly the policy if you look at, closing down schools and closing down all kinds of workplaces. And, it's the idea that everybody should be doing this. And then finally, there's indefinite, and this is a really important aspect of it, that there's no clear timeline on how long this is going to last. Sometimes there will be a specific date on something, but there's no overall plan of how long, how long this will be. And the first thing to say about this indefinite universal isolation is that it is drastically harming the livelihood of, conservatively tens of millions of Americans, I would really say the vast majority of the country. And it's harming them. And at the same time, they themselves are under no significant risk from COVID-19. So I'm not yet saying what the policy should be, but I just think that's a very important fact, that this policy is drastically harming the livelihood of tens of millions and really most of the country. And most people are under no significant risk from it. So the significant risk is for what they'll call the vulnerable, which is, the elderly, and then people who are what's called compromised. And so I'll just give you an example of the harm of this, and then I'll talk about the justice of it. So my girlfriend works as a therapist for kids with autism. And we are being told that, you should avoid any kind of interaction. Like you want to maximize your social distancing. And so she works with clients. So she'll go to the homes of clients and she'll be around the parents and around the kids. And the kids need in-person therapy. So if she's working with a kid and, he's just learning some reading skills and verbal skills, it's like that, it will permanently negatively affect him if she's not there, for a month or 2 months. And what she's being told is, hey, you shouldn't be around this kid at all, and we're not sure how much. And so that's obviously very affects her livelihood because she makes money largely from clients paying her to help, to give this great value to kids with autism whose lives she can vastly improve. So it's her livelihood is being attacked. And then the livelihood of the kid is being attacked, even though there is no real threat to either of them. There are many, many things that are more threatening. She's much more threatened by just driving over there than this thing. And so this should really give us pause that we are restricting the livelihood of really hundreds of millions of people who themselves are not under threat. And we're also, it's not that they are spewing something that is truly airborne in the sense is like impossibly contagious where nobody can be isolated from it. So I think the basic moral thing is, as much as possible, at least over the long term, if it's a long-term thing, we want individuals to engage in selective isolation. I think there are a couple of criteria here, but not universal isolation, but more selective isolation based on one is their vulnerability. So if you're super vulnerable to this, and we're going to talk about some of the problems largely created by government of lack of testing and then lack of expected lack of treatment facilities, but whatever the situation is, you want to engage in selective isolation. And I think people should be willing to take fairly extreme measures. And with loved ones, we should be, I'm thinking of someone in particular, in my case, I'm very close with who's in that age group. And we should be willing to take pretty extreme measures in terms of supporting them and cordoning them off. And isolation does not mean everybody's quarantined on some island and they're each getting it. No, you isolate them from each other as well, or at least, you, if they want to, you make it as easy as possible. So the key criterion has to be level of vulnerability. That should drive selective isolation. But the other thing that should drive selective isolation is how affordable is it for you to isolate? And this will vary from person to person vastly. So, for example, in Silicon Valley, you have many people advocating indefinite universal isolation, and they themselves are people who work at software companies. They're often, I don't want to make caricatures, but they're often introverted. They don't necessarily feel the need to be around that many people. I'm somewhat like this myself in terms of my writing work and whatnot. So if you can easily afford it, then there's a real case for isolating yourself to a certain degree, particularly if there's a reasonable time horizon with it. And then there are also, part of, you can isolate yourself in a less social sense, but you can just take certain kinds of precautions that are good for your health anyway, such as, because even though it's not deadly to you, the COVID-19, it can be a real pain if you get it. So things like washing hands and and not coughing in the air and that kind of thing. And these kinds of things can be incredibly they can help dramatically slow transmission. But it's notice that both of these are individuals taking responsibility and doing things that are consistent with their livelihoods. But what my girlfriend is being told to do, and what most of us are being told to do, is really shut down your livelihood for something that's not really threatening to you. Now, I want to talk about this issue of indefinite, because there's a certain threshold at which it may need to be universal, or I don't think universal, but at least in certain locations. But if that's the case, there are a couple of criteria that need to be followed. So one is that the government should give a really clear explanation of why universal is necessary. And I think in this case, some of the dynamics are, one is that testing got totally screwed up. So it's just so hard to know what to do, because we have no idea how many people have this. And I don't think we know that anywhere. So the state of testing is really bad. And there were definite screw ups there by government. And then the other thing is, lack of some of these basic elements of treatment, like face masks and whatnot. So there's just some really terrible stuff going on where medical workers are being exploited and at risk and sometimes dying because they're being exposed to such huge loads of this virus. And that's really bad. And if there's something where the government, so if there's like a specific time limited circumstance, then that's reasonable if the government can really explain how it applies to us, and it can really give a reasonable time frame of it. But I think crucial to this is government needs to acknowledge where it made mistakes. And I'm not talking about, I don't want to talk about parties or individual personalities, but in terms of the testing and the supplies, we have for better or worse, and I believe worse, we have a largely government-controlled healthcare system, and certainly where government plays a massive role in approving or not approving things, including tests for COVID-19. So there has to be, if they're asking for this kind of major setback, then there needs to be a really clear reason why, an explanation of what went wrong, what they did wrong, and then a really clear time horizon. And with all of this, there just needs to be an acknowledgement that it is so crucial for people to be free to pursue their livelihoods and their lives. And what we're seeing is just that is on such the back burner, and as a result, you just meet so many people who are being negatively affected by this. And just everywhere you go, at least in my experience, what have you guys found in terms of just how people are being affected by the indefinite universal isolation policies?
I mean, it's definitely varied at this point. I think, I have everything from friends who are, in industries that are actually benefiting from this economically, just in the sense of there's higher demand for certain kinds of medical services. Set aside the people who are actually on the front lines in that industry, which is a different scenario, down to people who, they do like wedding photography and things like that, and they have zero money and, in some cases don't have any savings. But I think the one thing that has been universal across all of the people I've spoken to is exactly what you're talking about, which is the or part of what you're talking about, which is the psychological costs of not knowing when life will return to normal, and of how bad things could get just on an economic level if this goes on further and further.
Stefan, what about you?
Well, I live in Germany, so my situation is a little bit different. But so in general, the reaction by the government has been somewhat confused, and I've seen, or there's something like a restaurant ban, but only after 6 p.m. because the food industry is essential, but like after 6 p.m. The virus apparently appears like a vampire. There have been impacts in particular branches where they need, as you mentioned, human contact, like face-to-face contact. Other branches, like the online gaming platform Steam, showed record player numbers because lots of people globally have been locked down, and so they make more money now than they usually do. But it's so it's very selective. It's often confusing, and it strikes me as totally not sustainable, because if you take it seriously, you don't know who is infected because the testing has been lacking. Then you have to lock down everything, but that's not sustainable because a lot of people need to do work, because if we just stop working for 3 months, all of us will be dead because nothing is produced and nothing can be consumed. So it's really very confusing, and I think a lot of this has to do with you know that the government coordinates this and politicians arbitrarily shut down things because they don't want to be responsible if something happens. And on the other hand, they didn't prepare the government healthcare system, and in Germany it's even more so than in the United States. They didn't prepare for the situation in any meaningful sense, so they have no information to work with. So it's sort of a mixed bag of half measures, and a lot of people will be impacted, and it's somewhat arbitrary.
I'm actually going to jump into my bonus idea of the day that I think is the most controversial, at least maybe to listeners of this program, but it fits in right now. And the reason it's controversial is because it challenges something that I'll bet many of you think is a good idea, or at least might feel to some extent is a good idea, which is the right to healthcare, the idea that healthcare is a right. And so my second idea, or my bonus idea rather, is that the corona crackdown, this tyrannical behavior, this indefinite universal isolation, illustrates the tyrannical nature of the, quote, right to healthcare. So my view of health, so healthcare is an aspect of health. My view of health is a responsibility. So it's a responsibility. Individuals, and so we have a right to the pursuit of healthcare, including to produce different forms of healthcare, whether medical care, medicines, medical services, so to produce them and of course to trade with others who produce them. But fundamentally, health is a responsibility, and we should be free to pursue it and produce it. But it's our right. We have a right to be free to pursue and produce it. We don't have a right to it. Now, the prevalent view is that we have a right to healthcare. And I want to emphasize that if we have a right to healthcare, a right is something that the government enforces coercively, ultimately at the point of a gun or some other decisive form of force. And so if something is a right, that means the government gets to define what it is and control how it is pursued. So the government, if we have a right to healthcare, the government gets to decide what is and is not healthcare, and it also gets to control us in the pursuit of that, because it's made it its job to give us what it considers healthcare. So then it gets to do what it wants to us to give us healthcare. So it really means the right to healthcare means the government has the right to control us in any way it wishes to provide what it considers healthcare. And I discussed this at some length, actually. I'd recommend there's a show I did with Yaron Brook the former CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute, now the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, my former boss in a past life. And if you look up, well, I guess we can include this in the links, but it's if you just YouTube Alex Epstein, Yaron Brook, Yaron space Brook, and Corona, this will definitely come up first unless YouTube has suppressed it. So yeah, check that out. So we discuss more about this issue. But so here I want to emphasize a particular aspect of what it means to have, what we're seeing with what it means to have the right to healthcare, which is that the government, it not only gets to control, how doctors behave and how they bill and what things should be covered under insurance and on all sorts, and who gets to be a nurse and who doesn't, all these different things. It also gets to control us when it gets to control us even more when it screws up. So what we see now is, I believe, increasing tyrannical control, largely to make up for the government's own incompetence. So I told you some of you guys weren't going to like this, but look at the two main reasons government is now demanding indefinite universal isolation. They'll often call it extreme social distancing, but there are two main reasons. There may be more, but here are two of them. So one is that our government-controlled healthcare system has failed to develop proper COVID-19 tests. I don't think that can really be disputed, that there were major failures involved here, and the government is in charge of testing. So one thing is the system has failed it has failed to develop proper tests. And then the idea is, well, we need to crack down because we have no idea who has this, and we have to be universal because you can't be selective because no one knows. I think there are problems with that argument because it's not anywhere near as contagious as measles, but nevertheless, that is a real consideration that we don't have tests, and so that makes policy a lot harder. And then the second one is that our government-controlled healthcare system allegedly will fail. So it has failed on the tests and allegedly will fail to scale healthcare to the levels needed that we would need if we were just free to practice voluntary and selective isolation. And you can see this in all the different graphs about flattening the curve. I'm sure people have heard of this, but if you just look up flattening the curve, you'll see there's the idea that if you leave people free, or if people don't distance or isolate themselves enough, then the need for healthcare will be very concentrated in time, and it will go above the system's resources, and then it'll be terrible, including like some of the stuff we've seen in Italy with like doctors being overworked and dying, and this really terrible stuff. But part of that is saying, well, there's a real question of, well, why is that line as low as it is? Why can't it go up rapidly? And we've seen at least many government-related failures where the ability to scale treatment is related. There's all kinds of issues of us not being prepared. And we do have a government-controlled healthcare system. We do not have at all a free market healthcare system. We have pockets of freedom, but it's overwhelmingly a government-controlled healthcare system. So essentially, people are saying, yeah, we've failed. The government-controlled healthcare system has failed to develop proper tests, and it will fail to scale. Therefore, we get to force indefinite universal isolation on you. Now, they're not putting it that way, but this is what it amounts to. They're saying, yeah, we can't control this problem that we've taken responsibility for, and we've prohibited you in all sorts of ways from taking responsibility. So now we get to, in effect, do whatever we want. And it's really like we get to keep you in your house. We get to lock you down. There's no right to assemble. I mean, what happened to the Constitution? It's just there's almost not a thought. So I just think it's really worth reflecting on this idea that it's moral and desirable to have rights to specific products and services. That always means the government gets to define what they are, and it gets to control you in its pursuit. And so it's just a fundamental point about liberty and human flourishing, and why it's so important for us to be free to pursue things by our own judgment, where we can define what we want and we can control how to pursue it. And then if we want to help others, then we can work to do that depending on what they want to pursue. But the idea that it's a right that's enforced by the government, that necessarily leads the government to define these things in very perverse ways, and it leads them to control us in very perverse ways. You guys have anything you want to add on that one?
Just one thing, which is, I think it's important important to see that what's happening is that a lot of the decisions are being made in the basis of fear and uncertainty. And what we advocate in energy, and what you talk about also in the broader conception of human flourishing, is our need for a framework for decision making, a framework that helps us make decisions about what will best promote human flourishing. And so without that framework, I think you could easily imagine seeing us swing back and forth between isolation, indefinite universal isolation, and then all right, people get frustrated, and so we'll just go back to life, but that doesn't quite work out because we get overwhelmed like Italy. You could see all sorts of scenarios happening, and nobody would know what would happen the next week, and it could be very paralyzing. And what a framework would allow you to do is you would still have fear and uncertainty, but you would have a decision making process that would give you as much certainty as possible in that kind of context, and let you make the best decisions possible to navigate through it. And that's I think that's sort of what we should be aiming for first and foremost, is a framework so that we're not making these arbitrary, unpredictable decisions.
And note that there's almost no interest certainly from government in this, and no recognition of the havoc that it's wreaking, and in terms of not having a framework and not having a policy. And what happens is it defaults toward something that is often indefensible. So right now, indefinite universal isolation, that's defaulting toward the only goal is slowing transmission of the virus. And I'd highly recommend listening to particularly the first 15 or 20 minutes of my interview with Yaron Brook, where we really challenge that goal in some depth. But that is not a pro-human flourishing goal, to say we're going to reduce the transmission of a virus at all costs. And the thing I keep emphasizing on that show, and I'll emphasize a little bit here, is that the fundamental need of life, of survival, let alone everything else, is production. And so you cannot just impede in haphazardly people's ability to produce, and many people's ability to produce as well as to enjoy life depends on close social interaction. And it's so many people's productive ability is being compromised. And then there's this whole dimension that, well, okay, now we're just going to give them welfare and different handouts and stuff. And we can get into the justice angle of that. But in terms of production, that's not making people more productive. You're still diminishing the productive ability across the board. And it very much resembles what we talk about in energy, where the lower cost energy is, the lower cost, which ultimately means the less human time it takes to produce any value. And you can think of it as the more freedom of social interaction you have, the more different kinds of value you can create, and the more value of any kind you can create. So there are all sorts of values that come from or that are connected to social interaction. And so just to universally promote isolation indefinitely, that is just so catastrophic to our ability to produce and flourish. And the idea is, oh, well, we'll send you some bills and then that'll make it right. Like that's going to be like, if you get a government, whatever they want to call it, like dividend, that's going to make up for your restaurant can no longer work, or your events business can no longer work. That is a huge blow. And I just wish that the people commenting on the threats involved with the virus, I really wish that they acknowledged the threats involved in isolating people. And if they did that, I would trust their recommendations much more. And it's quite analogous actually to certain climate scientists who just don't acknowledge any benefit to the energy use that comes with CO2 emissions. And then if they don't do that, you have every reason to think they're exaggerating any negatives of the CO2 emissions. Because if you ignore the benefits of something, even the obvious benefits of something, it's very likely that you are exaggerating the negative side effects. Next idea. Climate change obsession or climate change fixation prevented us from paying attention to real threats like coronavirus. So when this crisis started emerging, I remembered I was as part of a chapter, and I think chapter 10 in the new moral case for fossil fuels, I'd been writing about this kind of idea. And so I talked about, here's a quote. Now it might change in the final version, but I talked about climate myopia, which may better be called climate fixation. So Here's a quote: "Climate myopia, wherein we treat stopping climate change as the most important issue, causes us to ignore far more pressing concerns and will surely blind us to unknown ones going forward." And then I have later, "Finally, as a culture, we need to end climate change as an obsession. For one, human empowerment needs to be a positive priority." And then I have some more on that. But then I have, "There are many other real concerns that we are almost completely ignoring because we think that a couple degrees of change in the average temperatures around the globe is somehow going to prevent us from sustaining and enjoying our lives." And then I talked about antibiotic resistance, so the phenomenon of bacteria that can go against antibiotics, but it's very closely related to viruses. And it's just a fact that you cannot focus on everything. And if the whole society and the whole culture is fixated on climate, that is going to take their focus off other things. And there's a really good interview with a guy I know named Amish Adalja, who's an expert on infectious diseases. He did it with Sam Harris. And if you listen to the end of the interview, maybe the last 10 or 20 minutes, he talks about just how people in that community have been warning for years that we are ill prepared for different kinds of pandemics, and yet that gets no attention, or it used to get no attention. So what happens is it gets no attention until it needs attention, and then it gets a huge amount of attention, but we're ill prepared. So what needs to happen is we need to be thinking about things from a human flourishing perspective and really be aware of and encourage people to be aware of a wide spectrum of threats to human flourishing, as well as a wide spectrum of opportunities, and not have this fixation on one thing. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, so I mean, one objection or one relevant claim that I've heard from climate catastrophists is kind of goes in the other direction, where their argument is, well, look, here's a case where people predicted catastrophe and they were right. And so, that implies that we should be believed and listen to the catastrophists on climate. Now, I'll be interested in your response to that, Alex, but just one point that I'd like to point out is, I mean, it's not even clear that the, COVID-19, certainly the people who are saying that we needed to make preparations for a pandemic, I think have been proven right. But if we're talking about the kind of catastrophic claims that basically say, 50, million people are going to die or whatever, those clearly those have not yet been confirmed. But I think there is at least people making the parallel in the other direction. So what's your take on that?
Well, one thing is, the only positive I can see with all of this, I guess maybe one positive, is we become more rationally prepared for pandemic type issues, because that is a category of thing that has long scared me. I mean, infinitely more than changes in climate conditions. Just the idea, and I just think of it because changes in climate conditions they're not purposeful threats. They're inadvertent threats. That is, it's the storm doesn't care about us. It's not trying to hurt us. But with these different kinds of viruses and bacteria, they're actually engineered. They're evolved to. They don't have an animus against us, but they survive at our expense. They're trying to survive and replicate, and that comes at our expense. I'm particularly afraid of natural threats that are purposeful, deliberate threats. So that's just one thing, is more focus on those, I think is very warranted. So I would like to see that. But the only positive I can really think of besides that is that this is going to be how this plays out will be a really interesting illustration of how good different people's thinking methodology is and how our knowledge system works. And I'll be very interested. And I want to encourage people, whatever you've written on this, don't delete it. Like, let it stand. And I'm going to do it the same. And if I'm proven wrong about something, and I've posted a bunch on just my personal Facebook, it's usually I'm posting it as, hey, here's an idea. I'm not sure about this. So I haven't posted much that's definitive. But even there, I want to see, hey, where was I off and where was I right? Because I am suspicious of these doomsday scenarios. There's a lot that doesn't add up for me about them. And there's a really good article by, I can't pronounce, I don't know his pronunciation, but John Iodinas, this Stanford guy, which we can link to, but he has some stuff just about how we don't know anything about the data. But I'm very skeptical of like these infinite accelerating doomsday type scenarios, but I'm really interested to see how that pans out. And it's unlike the climate issue where it's a much longer term prediction and people are always changing their standards. So even when they predict millions or hundreds of millions of deaths due to climate and then it doesn't happen, then they can say, oh, well, but ice melted and that's really the problem. So there's this long-term issue and then this ambiguity issue. Whereas with this, number of deaths by this will be a pretty good measure. And it'll be really interesting to see how people's methodologies look. Now, people will have different interpretations, I'm sure. And if there's not if it's not a catastrophe, people will say, oh, it's only because we did these measures. But I still think it'll be pretty easy to tease out who was thinking properly about it and who wasn't. And then in terms of the climate catastrophist, well, I mean, if people were to have a view, if I had a view that there's no such thing as a potential catastrophe, then they could claim vindication. But the whole point about criticizing climate catastrophism is the evidence is that there's not a catastrophe here. And in fact, overall, our safety from climate is something that's improving, which I've talked about a bunch, including because we have low-cost energy from fossil fuels that allows us to build like a more and more climate-proof environment. So the fact that somebody is right about one catastrophe does not mean that everybody is right about every catastrophe. The people who claim the, Mayan apocalypse, they're not vindicated because somebody would be right about this. Although, I would say that if the mainstream really gets this right, then they should be proud of themselves. But I don't think they're in any way getting the policy right because they're just not paying attention to the negatives of it, of what their policies are. But it'll be really interesting if they're very wrong. So I treat it as, now people can consider this self-serving, but I think if there's a catastrophe, that just means there's a catastrophe. And if there's, I guess it would be interesting if all the people who are skeptical of climate catastrophe, if all of them said, oh, this is baseless, and then it was a catastrophe, then that would point out something about at least the people who did that methodology. Whereas mine is more, I'm pointing out, hey, the policies you're proposing are definitely catastrophic, and you're not acknowledging that, and I am not at all. I have almost no I have no expertise on the science of the viruses, but I do have expertise on the science of human flourishing and what indefinite universal isolation does to it.
So
next,
I have
go
one
ahead.
point to add to that, because
Go
I
ahead.
think the difference between policy and some like vague scenario is really important. It's not like we didn't spend billions and billions and billions of dollars into the healthcare system and agencies like the CDC. But what did we get from this, right? So we cannot ramp testing. We cannot ramp hospital beds, at least not fast enough. We cannot, like, at least in Germany, I know we don't have the capacity to isolate even like elderly care homes, which would be important because it's a risk group. And so you could say, well, yeah, we should have prepared for this. But if the government makes all the wrong policies and wrong decisions, this doesn't help at all. So what would have been possible, what would have been possible with that amount of money if we would have known ahead what kind of viruses would have been, like what would have been an effective measure to take, like that the testing is really important and how to ramp that up and so on. So it's like in the analogy with the climate, like even if a doomsday scenario would be real, like people could say, yeah, we were right about it. Yeah, but have you been right about the policies? Because so what would have happened if we could have impoverished ourselves in the energy system, like since the 1990s, what was prescribed? Where would we be, by the end of the 21st century, in a much poorer economy, much less prepared to something like sea level rise or extreme weather events and so on. So that's a different question. It's not like people can feel vindicated by vaguely saying, well, something's going to happen. Like you need to be very precise, and they make sort of a range of predictions that in itself is contradictory. Like it's a big difference whether we get like 3 degrees of warming or 6 degrees of warming by the end of the century, and certain amounts of sea level and so on. And so it's not like you can say, well, just trust the expert. Which expert, to what degree, what is he actually saying in terms of the range of possibilities, what's the reasoning and so on, and then translating into policies, that's even more complex.
Yeah, so I think of a lot of that as like their policy prescriptions have not been vindicated at all, and the policy prescriptions here have a bunch of overlap with their policy prescriptions, whereas they, one, it's ignoring the benefits of low cost energy, and the other, it's ignoring the benefits of, really people being free, but in particular, people being free to associate with one another in person, or you can think of it as freedom to socially interact. So in that case, there is a very negative parallel. Okay, this connects to the next idea. Idea number 3, a Green New Deal would be fatal in the fight against coronavirus. Or I can think of this as a Green New Deal would be coronavirus's best friend. So observe that whatever, the many problems we've seen in our healthcare system that are connected to coronavirus, we are bringing to bear. They're kind of 2 big things that we're noticing that not we're noticing, but that one can notice. And so I'd put them in the category of we're using a lot of machines to improve our lives, and then we're using a lot of manpower, and in particular, mental power in the form of the medical industry. And both of these are made possible by low-cost, reliable fossil fuel energy. So in the case of the machines, you can think about the hospital equipment, ventilators, factories that are scaling up to produce vital products, all the transportation machines that are bringing products where they're needed. All of these are being powered by low-cost, reliable energy, overwhelmingly from fossil fuels. And then another point that's a little more subtle but very important is that if you think about the manpower that's available in terms of the number of people in the medical field who can, and then you can even put more people in the medical field if necessary. There are regulations that can get in the way of this, but you can mobilize a lot of people to help with this issue if needed. That's only possible because of low-cost fossil fuel machine power that enables us to do the very basics of our survival, like grow our food and get water and shelter and clothing. Allows us to do those with very few people, very low cost, very little human time. So we have a lot of time freed up to do other things. In societies where they lack low-cost machine power, they're spending most of their time on manual labor for the basics, and there's not only do they lack the machines, but they lack the manpower and the mental power to use those machines and to otherwise help people through the medical industry. So in both of these, I think of it really as, the fossil fuel industry, by producing by far the lowest cost energy for most people, for billions of people around the world and hundreds of millions of people in the US, they're really unsung heroes of this effort. And then that relates to the Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal says we should rapidly outlaw fossil fuels and nuclear, which is almost 90% of our energy, and use almost 100% solar and wind. And not to be too repetitive with what I've talked about before, but solar and wind they're unreliable energy. I don't call them renewables, I call them unreliables. So no modern country is getting even 25% of their total energy from solar and wind. And there's so just an example that sticks with me, that's been sticking with me during this crisis, is like last year, Australia experienced a blackout when the solar panels stopped working, and it was a 9-hour blackout because of an unexpected cloud. And you just think of, they were expecting a certain amount of sunshine, but they had this big cloud and it stopped. And I've really been thinking, do we want our ventilators in factories to stop working when there are unexpected clouds? And really, like, the more we try to rely on unreliables, the less margin there is for error. and you're going to have crises. I mean, you're going to have times when you need a lot of electricity and you are not getting it. And we should really think about in these life and death issues, it is really life and death that the power be always available in the quantity that we need it. And that is not something you do with anything resembling 100% renewable. Nobody has any clue about that. But even as you try to approach that, you're getting in huge trouble. And then the other thing is that it's not only that it decreases the reliability of the power the more you try to use it, but it also dramatically increases the cost. Because when you have unreliable energy, it needs 100% backup from reliable energy. So then you need unreliable infrastructure plus reliable infrastructure, which is always more expensive than just reliable infrastructure. And so that adds cost. And then that means that for all kinds of purposes, it's more expensive. And if you think hospital, something like 50% of their costs are electricity based. And so you just think about already the strain that's put on medical care, and then just think about what is it like if energy is 3-4 times more expensive, like it is in Germany, where Stefan lives. So you guys have any thoughts on this issue? What would it be like to fight coronavirus under a Green New Deal?
I mean, well, this isn't exactly to that point, but I think it's worth connecting this to the point you made earlier about healthcare, which is we have had a New Deal in healthcare. If you think about the Green New Deal is essentially let's put the government in control of our energy decisions. We've put the government in control of our healthcare decisions, and it has contributed to our current problems. And I mean, you can just take something like certificate of need laws, which in order to build a hospital or have certain kinds of healthcare machines, you actually have to get approval from the government that there's a need for this, not that you can do it profitably or that you can use it, but basically it allows your competitors to come in and say, no, we don't think that there needs to be a new hospital in our neighborhood. And I'm not necessarily saying that that particular regulation is causally important in this case, but it's that you've put the government in control of something, and therefore you've taken away our ability of free individuals to adapt to something. And but the Green New Deal, I think, is much worse, because I think, the way that government control over healthcare is exercised, I don't think is fully on a human flourishing standard. It's more on a non-standard, whereas the Green New Deal is explicitly getting rid of the most pro-human sources of energy.
Stefan, any comments?
Yeah, I think if you want to compare that to something like the sort of lockdown right now, a lockdown has to be limited in some capacity at least. So some essential workers like water supply, food supply, and so on have to go on. Otherwise, we would all die, right? So the lockdown has to be limited. It will be damaging, but it has to be limited in some form. So, but a Green New Deal threatens essentially the underlying energy supply. So in a best case scenario, it will make it much more expensive, but it will somehow technically work. Given the proposals, I don't think that's true, but it is essentially unlimited and unending damage to the economy. It will go on for generations, if you keep that policy going, because you are taking away sort of the best energy source option in most applications, and forces us to replace them with something inferior. And this makes it more expensive. What does it mean? It means we don't have many of the options that we have right now. So it will impoverish us. At least it will make us much poorer. So this will be much harder to fight anything, or to do anything. And fighting Corona will certainly be more problematic in a poor economy. And this is again an analogy to the climate policies. The question is, do you do more harm with certain policies that will make you poorer and have less access to resources and so on, compared to what you're preventing? Just from a purely utilitarian calculation.
So this connects very strongly to idea 4, which is that the Corona recession is a mild preview of the Green New Deal. One way to think about what's going on is that your ability to be productive is being restricted by indefinite universal isolation. It's a fundamental restriction on the ability of millions of people to be productive because social interaction is so crucial to the kind of value that they create. It's certainly true with some of the stuff we do, like speaking at events. I think we create a lot of value by speaking at live events, but if there are no live events with speakers, then we can't create that kind of value. And there's certain kinds of consulting that work much better in person. And so to some extent, at least we're restricted in creating that kind of value. And then you think of people in service industries, and then it's just totally gutted. So, and that's really what it's the lack of productive ability or the decline in productive ability that's so devastating, because somebody then to consume value, you need to produce value. So you need to produce value so that you can have a home to live in. But if you can't produce value, then you can get kicked out of your home and then be in much more danger, by the way, from coronavirus or anything else. Or if you don't create enough value, then you can't have food, or you can't have as high quality food, and you can't have as high quality clothing. And then there's the whole issue of medical care, and then all sorts of expenses to enjoy your life. So just as the corona crackdown is this indefinite universal isolation is making us less productive, as Stefan mentioned, there's somewhat of a temporary dimension to this. Whereas if you permanently and fundamentally gut our energy economy, our ability to produce energy, if you force us to produce energy using processes that are far, far more costly, then that means that every instance of machine power is more costly. And that means that fewer people can afford it. And you can think of a couple of instances of this. There's three main ways in which low-cost energy benefits you, and then where higher-cost energy harms you. So the most direct is the most obvious, although we're not even taught to think of this, but it's just any direct use of machines that you have. So you can think of, you're using your computer, and that includes using energy on the cloud, which is often much greater than your computer, but using your washing machine, using your vacuum cleaner, using your lights, using your automobile, heating your home, cooling your home. Like all of these are, direct uses of machines. And so when the cost of those go up, then the affordability of them goes down. And certain of them, if you're on any kind of normal budget, you have to do without them. But it's not just the direct uses of energy, it's the indirect uses of energy, which is number two, that is not the machine power you're directly using, but the machine power that goes into everything you're using, including the machines, but including the non-machines. So if I take the home that I live in, all of this was produced by machine power, and that made it a lot lower cost because it took a lot less human time than if it hadn't been produced using machine power. And so that would mean I couldn't afford as nice a home, and I couldn't have the furniture, and I couldn't have the carpet, and all of these things would just be far higher cost. So it's not just everything that uses machine power that becomes more expensive, but it's that everything that is produced using machine power becomes more expensive. And then related to that, number three is that the lower cost machine power is, the lower cost everything is, and that ultimately means the more time you have that's free to do what you choose with. And that's just a huge thing where the more machine power we have, the lower cost it is, the less of a manual labor life that we have to live, and the more we can do other things, including, as I mentioned earlier, engage in medical care. And then there are all sorts of recreational activities, and you can choose jobs that you want to have that don't involve a lot of manual labor, but they involve a lot of mental labor. So the whole freeing up of human time depends on low-cost, reliable energy, which is overwhelmingly, which nothing is still close to fossil fuels in providing. So something like a Green New Deal, by making energy far less reliable and far higher cost, what it means is that all of your direct uses of machines become more expensive, but really everything that you do becomes more expensive, which means that you and everyone else have less time everyone is doing more manual labor, which means that they can be less productive and have less time to enjoy themselves. And this is what you see in poor countries, where what's going on? They're not using much machine power themselves. Not much machine power is going into producing the things they use. And guess what? Huge amounts of their time are spent on the basics like food, water, even the crudest shelter. And you see this whenever you have a productivity decline. These are the dynamics. You can produce less and you're more manual labor. So if you take like Venezuela, what's happening, there are a bunch of different dynamics, but ultimately people are becoming less productive, so their lives get worse and they're more of manual labor lives. And so that happens when you increase the cost of energy, and it happens when you decrease the freedom to socially interact. All of these are fundamental attacks on our productive ability, and thus they're fundamental attacks on our ability to flourish. So if you're suffering right now, then and you feel like, wow, I cannot do as much either because I can't afford as much, or even I'm not allowed to do it, really think about, okay, this is a regression, and this is exactly the kind of regression that the Green New Deal would get us by forcing us to use unreliable, high-cost energy. Anything you guys want to add about this?
Yeah, I mean, one point to make is, so I think some of the advocates of the Green New Deal and the environmental movement more broadly, it's not just that their policies have these consequences, it's that it's part of the goal. So but they'll often put it as, we're for a no growth economy, and that they'll equate that with a sustainable economy. But I think part of the preview of the Green New Deal that we get here is that there is no such thing as a stagnating no growth economy. You have progress or you have regress, and regress happens very quickly and can get very bad because of just the way the nature of an economy works. You can't slow it down like it's, like a train or something like that. It's all the pieces need to be working together and moving forward, or it's more like sticking a wrench in the gears of a clock. And so that's what I think should be really terrifying about the Green New Deals, that you're not talking about lower growth or even no growth with people just living the same lifestyle that they are this year for 20 years. It's that you get decline, and that I think you can get it very, very fast.
And one thing there is just, there's a lot more to say about this, but the basic assumption behind growth is illusory or it's unsustainable. Or at least one of the basic assumptions is, well, the world has finite resources, and therefore they were just inevitably heading toward a train wreck. And one point I make, and I'll make now, is just that the ability, resources are potentially unlimited, because we create resources by intelligently reshaping raw matter and energy, and the world is just an effectively unlimited amount of raw matter and energy. So there's no limit to how much we can grow, and we should hope and expect that future generations will see us, even the wealthier ones among us, as quite poor. All right, that is today's show. I hope you enjoyed the big ideas on the show. And so there's number one was that the policy of indefinite universal isolation is immoral and un-American. Number two is that climate change fixation prevented us from paying attention to real threats like coronavirus or COVID-19. Point three was that a Green New Deal would be fatal in the fight against coronavirus. And then four is that the corona recession is a mild preview of the Green New Deal. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Also, if you are interested in a speaking engagement, maybe a virtual engagement, since people aren't doing a lot of in-person stuff now, or you're interested in help with your messaging, if you're an organization, you can email us about speaking or consulting. Email don@industrialprogress.net. Make sure you're on my mailing list, which is to get weekly updates about this show and about lots of other stuff at alexepsteinlist.com. And for good measure, follow me on Twitter. I've been posting a lot there lately. There's a lot of stuff going on. Twitter is really interesting these days, I find, because it's really interesting to see how people I agree with and disagree with, or particularly people I agree with, how they're thinking of COVID-19. Sometimes that challenges my thinking. Sometimes it challenges my positive estimate of the person's thinking in general. So that's just a side note, but that I found that really interesting. But if you want to know what I am thinking about and recommending, that can be a good place. Thanks to Don and Stefan for being with me. We'll be back next week with another set of great topics. Hope you enjoyed this one. Until next week, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.